Been a lot of talk about team transitory versus team permanent as far as inflation is concerned. And you were always on team transitory. Why was that?
Well, for a number of reasons, to have inflation become entrenched in the system and essentially, feed on itself, which is one of the concerns that was raised by economists like Larry Summers. He wasn't alone, but he was probably the most vocal here in the US. And he was worried of a situation where, wages in particular would begin to rise. And then as wages increase, companies would raise prices because their costs are going up and labor is a huge cost of production. And then workers would, say, I'm not going to work for that because I need more money. And then you get the old wage price spiral. It was very hard to imagine how you were going to have a scenario like that take hold in the US, where, the labor movement has been substantially weakened over the last 40 years.
People like Larry Summers sometimes sound as though they're still living in the 1970s.
Yeah, that was the reference back to either the 60s or the 70s, that we were going to end up in that sort of he would talk about stagflation as well, where you'd end up with very little growth, high unemployment, and high inflation alongside. And of course, none of that is what ended up happening. So, what I was saying from the early stages was that this is a supply shock. This is a negative supply shock. And, we in the US in March of 2020, when COVID really hit, we basically told every worker in this country, if you're not essential to the economy, stay home. We didn't have vaccines. We didn't know if we would ever have vaccines. We had, our most famous White House sort of scientists saying it could be 4 or 5 years before we develop an effective vaccine. We didn't know. Businesses were told, don't open your doors. Workers were told, stay home. It was a negative supply shock, and it obviously caused people to spend money very differently. We couldn't go to bars and restaurants and gyms and theaters and nail salons and all of those kind of service-oriented outlets. And we're a service economy. 80% of the US economy is service. And we mostly couldn't do any of those things. So what did we do? Our kids were home from school. We were told to work from home if we could. So you turn your spare bedroom into a home office. You buy new furniture and, desk chairs and tablets and all that kind of stuff. Well, all those things have to be manufactured somewhere. And we've got global supply chains. And so we all remember the fragility of supply chains, right? You had shipping containers that weren't available and shipping costs going up and ships that were backed up at the ports, and we didn't have people to unload them, and trucking, and it all fed into, in various ways, increases in prices early on in goods production. We weren't getting factories that manufacture those little chips, the little semiconductors that go into just about everything now, from washing machines and microwave ovens to PCs and automobiles and all of that. We couldn't get those things. And so used car prices went crazy for a while. And anyway, the point is that we changed our patterns of consumption. We couldn't buy a lot of services, and we tried to cram a lot of dollars into a very narrow and fragile supply chain for goods, and we got inflationary pressures. And so you had to sort of game out whether you thought the increases in inflation that really started April of 2021, you really started to see inflation kind of 4%-ish, and you said, okay, this is twice what the Fed targets. So how should we respond? And the debate about transitory was really among economists saying, does this merit a response by the central bank? Does the central bank need to respond to the increasing inflationary pressures the way it would typically fight inflation, which is by raising interest rates? And I never, not once, not I think in any interview ever, did I take the position that interest rate hikes were the right way to respond to that kind of inflationary pressure that I saw.
I don't think any MMT economist did.
We didn't think it was the right medicine. Yeah. And we are skeptical of the transmission mechanism even before COVID. We weren't, you know, as confident as many of our peers in the transmission mechanism. Like, how do rate hikes actually work? Do they work to dampen aggregate demand in a reliable way, and that brings down inflation? Or is it more complicated than that? And can rate hikes actually, under certain circumstances, exacerbate inflationary pressure? So we didn't want to turn to the interest rate tool as a policy response. We said there are a whole bunch of other things that we could do to try to work on the kinds of problems that were creating the inflationary pressure. And President Biden did a lot of that. You know, he said, if we have problems at the ports, and this is part of what's creating some inflationary pressure, let's deal with the problems at the ports. So he ordered, you know, you got to run 24/7. And we're going to help with trucking and licensing, and we're going to get more drivers out there. And if we don't have enough workers in the labor force, and it's getting hard for employers to find the people they need, maybe part of the reason is that millions of workers, especially women, are sitting on the sidelines because they can't find affordable childcare. And so let's deal with that, and we'll try to bring some workers back in. What about immigration? What about, you know, you go down the list, and there are a whole lot of things that this administration did, later using the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to try to deal with some of the increase in, you know, gas prices that were becoming a hardship for millions of families.